So hello and welcome to episode 8 of Regulate.tech. I'm Richard Allan, and with me is...
Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad.
And today we're going to do something a little different. I mean, we've been making several episodes, weekly episodes of this podcast, and Nicklas and I are really enjoying it. We want to carry on. And we know that some of you listening into this will know us already. But there may be others who are thinking, who are these guys and why do they think their thoughts on tech regulation are worth sharing? So today we thought, let's add some context by doing something a little different and talking about who we are and where we've come from. And then next week we'll go back to the crunchy stuff, the substance of technology regulation. So I'm going to kick it off. And I'm going to start at the beginning, and Nicklas, really, and ask you, kind of as a teenager and sort of running into university years, like, what were the things that really interested you? What were you working on at school and got you excited?
I was in Stockholm. I'm a Swede, born and bred. So I spent time in a Swedish high school. And the things that really got me enthusiastic were very depressed French existentialists and philosophy in general. I loved philosophy and law, actually, strangely enough, because I really wanted to know more about law. So as I left high school and applied to university, I applied to a course in what in Sweden is called theoretical philosophy. That's ethics. That's not ethics. That's sort of ontology and epistemology, etc. And to law school. So that's essentially what I was planning to do with my life at the time. Philosophy and law, very unclear how you combine both of them. But that was what I think I was most interested in then.
And what was your relationship? Your relationship with technology at that time. Were you into computers? It was very different, as we're going to get onto, a very different time.
It was a very different time. And in order to answer that question, I need to go back to when I was 8 years old, when I got my first computer. So my father brought home something that was called an ABC-80, which was a Swedish-made computer that had its own version of BASIC and some very, very simple games. And I loved it. It had these 5.25 inch discs, and it had a black and white screen, and its basic language. The basic language was super simple. And I remember that I taught myself programming because I wanted to cheat at one of the games. The games was called Worm, and it was sort of about just driving this worm around the screen. And it got longer and longer and started driving faster and faster. And I found a way that I could make it move even faster every second time. So if I just started playing and then handed it over to my friend, he would get a consecutively faster and faster and faster and harder and harder and harder game, whereas mine would sort of progress at a leisurely pace and I could easily beat him. So I guess cheating was my introduction to computer programming. And I was 8 years old. My first own computer that I bought and I saved for months was a Commodore 64. A friend of mine had gotten the VIC-20, but I got the Commodore 64, and I tried to learn poke and peek and all of the different sort of kind of machine language things that you could do with it. But I gave up and installed Simon's Basic, which was my other big computer experience, because Simon's Basic allowed you to do sprites. And sprites were like graphic, and you could almost make games. And the only thing that was missing was sort of any experience whatsoever in thinking about games. So that went so-so. So that's and that then continued on, right? I always had a computer. I always was tinkering with it. And, I moved on to the IBM PC. I had one of the first Apple Macs, the Macintosh in Sweden, actually, because a friend of mine was importing them. And then I got the Mac Lisa, and I loved it. And I played Transylvania on the Mac Lisa, which was an epic game. It was really, really good. So, well, you see the pattern. It's usually, you can say, it started with Commodore 64. I had, one of my first Christmas gifts was the Atari 2600. I was really good at asteroids. I never, ever understood that. So there was this horrible E.T. game, which might have been one of the worst computer games in history, that was released for the Atari 2600. And I remember spending an entire Christmas break just trying to figure out, what was what? How did you actually play this game? Because it was far from obvious. So that's sort of a hodgepodge of experiences that then led me on. So, but let's hear from you.
Yes, I'm sorry. That was a lovely picture of you as a philosophical, legal geek way back when. I guess I was an archaeological geek. So I was obviously educated in the UK. I sort of used to like both sciences and arts, but in the UK system you have to choose, and at 16 you've got to go in one direction or the other. So I actually went to the direction of learning the classics, Latin, Greek. I was a linguist. I'd enjoyed science and maths. I had a weird experience when it got to calculus, so abstract math, anything to do with arithmetic, I get. Anything to do with kind of more abstract mathematical concepts just never landed. So I sort of felt stuck in that direction, went off in the Latin and Greek direction. I remember coming across computers, and I think I'm a little older than you. And at that stage, a computer was something that if you went to a fancy school, they might have one of, and they had a computer club, and only the people in the computer club got to play with the computer. And I remember going to hang out with people in the computer club, and they, again, games. They had a Star Trek game that was written in BASIC and involved ASCII characters on the screen. So there'll be an ASCII character for your Starship Enterprise, and asterisk character for the Klingons, and you had to navigate this grid. It's very mathematical. And I really enjoyed that, and that was my first taste of programming. You could get the basic code and read it, and I thought that was quite exciting. So I might have sort of headed off in that direction, but for another of those sort of accidental things that happened, that there was an archaeological excavation near to where I went to school, and I went down there and thought, ooh, I like this, and started volunteering. And so as I sort of got into my late teens, here I was, a classicist studying the ancient texts, and in my spare time digging up Roman artifacts on an archaeological site, and so that then became my real passion. And so I went on then to university. I got a bit more modern than Latin and Greek, because I went on to study Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic. So we went from sort of 500 AD to 500 BC to 500 AD, which was the sort of the classical period, to 500 AD through to about 1200 AD, where we were reading the Norse sagas in the original, the Old Norse sagas in the original, and Welsh texts like the Mabinogion, which is a sort of classic Middle Welsh text. So that was it. So I sort of had original taste of tech, and then got massively diverted into archaeology and all things linguistic and classical.
But you were essentially on like an Indiana Jones track, right? That was, you were supposed to get a hat and a whip and then go off into the jungles. That sounds like it, right?
Exactly. And I think, you could say that. Yes, I remember watching an Indiana Jones movie on my first archaeological dig with all the archaeologists, and we were whooping and cheering in the cinema, all the wrong bits, because that's what archaeologists do. And that was so much fun. So yes, I when I left school, that was it. I was off, and within a week of leaving school, I was at an archaeological site in Wales, and then I moved to one in France, and then one in the Netherlands. Archaeology in the Netherlands is really good fun, because you dig a hole, and then you've got to jump in there really, really quick and record everything before it fills up with water. And you've got to jump out again before you drown. So that was like fun archaeology. And then actually, by the time I got to university, I was off in South America. I actually spent quite a bit of time excavating in Ecuador, which was the true Indiana Jones.
You were literally in the jungle then. So I mean, that's the proper Indiana Jones stuff. Did you get any statuettes that were cursed, or
no cursed statuettes? Although it did, it got hairy at various times. There were a couple of times where guns were pointed at me, and I didn't have a whip. Yeah, I know it's kind of occupational hazard in some of the zones we were in. Once because we'd disrespected a night watchman on the site next to the archaeological site, and the other time because people thought we were pirates, because we were sleeping on a beach near an archaeological site, and the locals couldn't quite understand what these people were doing sleeping on a beach. We did try and explain to them that we were English archaeologists, archaeologos ingleses. By the time we got to the village, this had become Italian psychologists, psicólogos italianos, through sort of word of mouth. But anyway, so yeah, that was the Indiana Jones experience. And incidentally, my first flight as a young person, we never flew. My very first flight, I got the age, I think 19 or 20, and it was to Quito in Ecuador. So that was quite a good sort of
really cool.
baptism of flying. All the other stuff had been ferries and stuff before that, including a ferry to Oslo one time.
Between sort of the English archaeologists and the Italian psychologists and the pirates, I think you're triangulating a really interesting persona there. Right? So you want to be in the middle of those three.
Yeah, maybe that's the way we've developed, maybe over time. But yes, that was all fun. So let's move on then. So you're I'm going to come back to you now, a lawyer and a philosopher at university, and you leave. What does a legal philosopher do for a living? Where did your career take you in your 20s? And how did you get started?
Well, I think the thing that happened was that the computers came back, right? So one of the things that happened was in the middle of when I was going to university, 92, 93, 94, suddenly I sort of just stumbled on this thing called the internet. And I was taking a few computer science courses, and I started out just, FTPing everything that I could possibly FTP down on computer languages and computer culture, etc., from the school computers, because they were all connected to the internet. And very fast, as I remember it, although I may be misremembering it, we all got modems at home, dial-up modems. And soon enough, I started understanding that this internet thing was really interesting. So by around 95, I was pretty good at doing HTML. I could hack my own JavaScript. I had even tinkered a little bit with object-oriented languages and all that stuff. And I was at the same time spending an enormous amount of time at the university, not always studying, and I know this will surprise you, but there were actually other things one could do at university, including things like designing the website for the local university newspaper, because one of their editors was really cool, and she then later became my wife. And so there were a lot of different things that sort of distracted. But one thing that happened was that during university, I saw a small ad that said, do you know HTML? And that was basically the only thing they wanted to know about you. If you knew HTML, call us. And so I called these people up, and it turned out that they were computer educators. They were educating firms, and they're educating the employees of firms on using the internet. So I became a consultant for them, still working at the university. And what I did was I trained people in using the internet. This sounds incredible today, because why on earth would you do that? How hard can it be? But this was really a thing. You trained people, and you taught them to use things like WinFTP, how to sort of transfer files. I remember we sort of taught them which websites were really good, because, how do you use Yahoo? At the time, there was no Google. We taught them to look up the weather at the CNN website. And I remember we had one special class that I really adored with a fair amount of elderly ladies from the technical university who were supposed to be taught the internet. And this was in November in Sweden. And, November in Sweden is no hope, no mercy, November. And so when we were looking at the weather, it was gray, cold, dark, damp for 7 weeks. And, her faith in the internet was absolute. So she raised her hand and she said, Nicklas, where do you click to change? So she wanted to change the weather. So I did that, and the computers led me on to legal informatics, and I worked as a research amanuensis in legal informatics for a while. That led me on to a research institute called the Swedish Institute of System Design, where I worked for a little bit. And then, just as I was in 1999, we're at the end of the 20s now, I was offered a stipend to go to Menlo Park. I'll stop at that cliffhanger, and then we'll go over to you.
So you did manage to pull together your tech and your legal as you got started in that profession. Fascinating. And as an educator, I remember those days when your modem was upgraded from 19.2K to 38.4K, and suddenly the world, everything was possible. Happy days.
Yes, I wonder if we had the same. We had 28.8 and 56.6.
That's right.
Those were the speeds we had, I remember. Yes.
Yeah. No, it went at 9.6 increments, wasn't it? It's 9.6K, 9.6,000 bytes, and then 19.2, and then 28.4, and then it just kept going from there, 37.6.
Yeah.
Anyway,
were they bytes or bauds?
Bytes, I think. Or bits. No, bits. They were bits, weren't they?
or
Baud.
baud?
Baud is a bit per second, I think, if I remember.
I
A
think so,
baud
yes.
was 1 bit per second, yes. So,
I think they were baud, sorry.
yeah, no, they were baud.
Those were the days, yes.
You're absolutely right. So by a factor of 8, so 9.6 baud was 1,200 bytes in a second. Wow. And there'll be a lot of people who are younger than us scratching their heads if they're listening to this right now.
That's completely fine. We have reached sort of the edge of grumpy old men, so we can do a bit of that, I think. Yes. What about you? You were sort of Indiana Jones. You were a pirate in Peru, essentially.
That's in Ecuador. And
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Pirate in Ecuador.
Graduated, ran off to Ecuador, and then came back to the UK, and I moved to the city of Bath, which is a beautiful ancient city in southwest of England. And I ended up sort of working on building sites and in pubs. And, I was looking around and thinking, are there jobs in archaeology? There were actually 2 professional posts in archaeology in the city of Bath. And I knew both of the people who occupied those posts, and they were both relatively young and healthy. So it didn't look like a job was going to become available. So here I am, washed up in Bath in my early 20s, finding that my archaeological career is in ruins. And that's deliberate. You can just groan at that point.
I don't know what to do with that. Sorry.
No, that's good. The old ones can be the best. So anyway, so I'm there. It feels like a bit of a dead end. And while I've been working in Ecuador, there'd been a guy who came and did the computers, because increasingly people were using computers to record what happened on an archaeological site. So moving from just writing it all down on bits of paper to sort of basic databases. And this guy, I was very impressed by him, not least by the fact that he got put up in a hotel while the rest of us were sleeping in tents. It was sort of like there was the computer guy is a special guy, and so he had sort of inspired me to think, refresh this interest I'd had, back to the Star Trek game and all of that. Or maybe this computer thing is interesting. And it's funny you said a small ad, because that was my experience. I was looking at the Guardian newspaper, and there was a small ad, and I'll paraphrase it, but only just. It basically said, "Are you a useless arts graduate looking to learn some useful skills? And if you are, come and do a master's degree in information technology." And I thought, well, this is good. So, and it was at Bristol Polytechnic, as it then was. It's been rebranded now, the University of West of England, but the Bristol Polytechnic, as it then was, essentially the government paid for me to go and do a master's degree in IT. And I went there, and I found that I loved it. We learned COBOL. That was our sort of core programming language, which is kind of the computer equivalent of Latin and Greek. I mean, it's an ancient language that's still sort of widely used. And in fact, probably if you're using an online banking app now, COBOL won't be using the front end, but somewhere in the back end, there's some system probably still in your bank that uses COBOL that no one, wanted to break. And so they've left it running anyway. So learned some very sort of classic languages, got my master's degree in IT. I actually brought my interest together because you had to do a degree project, and my degree project was to build an urban archaeological database for the city of Bath. And so I pulled together the data they had from the excavations with their mapping data, wrote a lot in Lisp. I loved Lisp. Lisp is a language not used much now, but it's
language.
Just a million brackets, everything in brackets, all super recursive. So I wrote a lot of stuff which used this Lisp, which came with a drawing program called AutoCAD at the time, and I used that to merge together data from databases with drawings of archaeological sites. That was all fun. That was my master's degree project. And then I was sort of, as I reached the end of that, thought, what can I do that's useful? And I applied for a job with the National Health Service. And my boss at the time who recruited me said he recruited me by accident, and he had a very good sense of humor. I loved my boss then. So it might have been a joke, but it was a great joke. So I've kept it. And that was it. He had gone to the recruiting agency, and he said he wanted someone who was very logical. And they typed logical into their database. And my CV said, worked as archaeological excavator, archaeological this, archaeological that. And so he said, I hit all the buttons because I had my archaeological experience, which both proves sometimes how things can be serendipitous and proves how literal computers are. Anyway, he got me, saw me, never worked in IT before, but he took a chance, brought me in, and then I worked for the rest of my 20s. I worked in the UK National Health Service, first building networks at a time when the internet protocol was a banned protocol in the UK National Health Service because it wasn't an official registered International Telecommunications Union protocol. And the first job was getting, at that time, the only people who had computers were the secretarial staff who used them as glorified word processors. And my first job was to build a network and move those people from WordPerfect to Microsoft Word, which is new. This is pre-Windows. Then Windows came along and I had to install that and get people used to Windows. I was the IT guy, and I learned how to turn it off and on again very gracefully. That is the trick, and it works we all know it works in like 90% of times, but you can do it in a particularly graceful way. I think that helps win credibility. So yes, I did the classic tech support, built networks, and then actually went on to build a management information system. So I worked in part of the health service administration. They had the databases they had ran on they were called PDP-11s, old mini computers, and they ran in a programming language called MUMPS, which I think has been rebranded as M, just the letter M. And MUMPS is like a super, super efficient programming language where everything is done with just sort of single letters. And at that time, this was a health service database that had a database of 1 million patients. And like now you could have a database of 1 million things on your phone. But at that time, you needed a mini computer and like a super, super efficient language to be able to handle 1 million records. And my job was to kind of get the data out of that database and then create all the bits of glue that allowed you to extract information and display it in user-friendly stuff like Excel spreadsheets and sort of user-friendly desktops. So I did that the rest of my 20s. I built the system for one health authority, and then within the NHS, we sold it to a range of other NHS authorities, probably ended up about 20 or 30 of them, took the software, and I would go around the country and try and extract the data from whatever variety of mini computer they had, get it into some kind of holding area, and then get it out on the network, which I loved. Wrote a lot of SQL.
I love that. It's a career based on a fuzzy match. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
It's I like it. It's very iconical. It's very good. And so that's your 20s. That's essentially what you were doing. Yeah,
that's right. And that's cool. Me there, and I'm going to leave me there and come back to you and think as you go into your 30s. So you've been an educator, you've worked at the institute. And now you've just left us. The cliffhanger you left us on was that you were heading off to Menlo Park, which for those people who don't know is the home of Google and is at the heart of the Silicon Valley. So young Nicklas is heading off to Menlo Park on a stipend. Tell us.
The home to Facebook, but much later. And at the time, Google always kept.
But I think Facebook, Mountain View.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, I think so. Yes, I need to do a quick detour. So before I came into the institute, the research institute, I also finished my studies in philosophy. And the last year in philosophy, you were supposed to write 2 papers, essentially, your thesis. And at that time, I had thought that I should be able to use something from my computer experience in working in philosophy. So I decided to write about artificial intelligence. So this is 1998. I wrote a short program that fell off the table, and then tried to teach it not to fall off the table. And when I did that, I then applied D.C. Dennett's theory of the intentional stance to see if it was easier to explain my program as intentional than mechanistically through the algorithms that it was using, and tried to sort of explore this question of whether or not my little program was conscious. So cruel experiments with computer programs then led me on to my thesis that I wrote about Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind, this idea that mind is not describable as a single set of software, but as a whole community of different pieces of software, different identities. And so I was doing artificial intelligence in philosophy. I had legal informatics. And so that's what brought me into the institute. And then there was this Post announced it's a stipend, really, where the Swedish Office of Science and Technology asked for somebody to come and do essentially business and political intelligence in Silicon Valley. It was really, really hard job to get, but I incredibly managed to get it because for once they didn't want to have an engineer, which was, I think I was the only non-engineer who applied, and they were sort of attracted by this idea of someone with a legal background and with a little bit of philosophy and cognitive science there, that they could show that they were not just catering to engineers. So I got to pack up my bags and travel off to Menlo Park. And I spent all of 1999 and half of the year 2000 during the bubble, essentially, in Menlo Park. And it was tremendously fascinating just to see the enormous amount of energy, money, the hopes, the enthusiasm, and then slowly realize that this is probably not going to be sustainable. And even though, I think the bubble created some fantastic companies, and I'm not sure at all that we wouldn't have the internet economy we have today if it wasn't for that. It was very clear to all of the people who were there that we were in a bubble. I remember attending an event by Red Herring, the founders of Red Herring, where they read out the valuations of different companies and then had the audience cry out loud, "On paper," for every valuation. And then they started to read out the amount of money that they had burned, these different companies. And there was this gentleman in the front row who had far too many drinks and was one of the venture capitalists. And when they read out the first amount of sunk cost in one of these companies, he cried, "On paper." And the entire room became silent, and the lecturer leaned into the microphone and said, "No, sir, that's real money." That was sort of a chilling moment, and you realize that, this might not be going entirely well. So I did this for a year and a half, and then in my 30s, I returned to Sweden, and I had been recruited into the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, where a fantastic mentor of mine had decided that he wanted to set up a Stockholm Chamber of E-commerce because there were so many e-commerce companies, and he wanted to sort of figure out what we could do for them, etc. So I got around to do that for 5.5 years, I think, and I loved it. It was really interesting. It was at the intersection of politics and law and technology and businesses, and it was super fascinating. So that's half of my 30s. Then after 5 years, I decided I wanted to go do something else, and I was contacted by an old friend who asked if I wanted to go found a newspaper, a current affairs magazine, something like a Swedish Economist was the vision we had. I'm not sure we attained that, but it was the vision. And so I went off and did a startup, which was wonderful. So I was one of the founders of this current affair magazine, and we did everything from, find a printer in Lithuania, hire people, get advertising, set up subscription services, and get all of the articles in, build the web. So it was this enormously interesting project. And just running a company and understanding how that is done was great. And after 2.5 years and the project was up and running, I got an offer to go to the US as an Eisenhower Fellow. And this Eisenhower Fellowship is essentially a 3-month trip around the US where you get to meet with whoever you want to chat with, essentially. So you could point to different people. And one of the people I pointed to was the founder of the policy team at Google, Andrew McLaughlin. And so I really badly wanted to meet Andrew. And Andrew was just returning from China. He was 2 hours late, but I persistently waited around and then went on, I think, to quite bad grace, badger him about why Google was entering China. And, he bravely put up with me, and we had a good discussion, and I left thinking that that's a really interesting company. Came back to Sweden, did a little bit more work with the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce and with the magazine. And then in 2007, again, a small ad, this time in The Economist, looking for a Nordic Policy Council for Google. And so I sent an email, and within a surprisingly brief time, somebody called me up and said that, yes, Andrew McLaughlin would like to interview me. I did a series of interviews during which Andrew quite gleefully asked me if I changed my mind on China. So that was quite rightful. And we had good discussions. And they ended up hiring me as a Nordic Policy Council. So at the end of my 30s, in 2007, I started a job with Google. And I kept that job until 2012. 39 when something else happened, but then we're moving from the 30s. So over to
we'll
you.
get on that. But I mean, during your 30s, you start as a civil servant, you go through this promotion of e-commerce in Stockholm, and then you go through into this startup. We sounds fascinating, and that was a paper printed magazine, was it? That was your primary distribution.
We were very particular about this. We wanted to make sure that we had perfect paper. So it was a high quality paper production, because we felt that there was something to be said for it. And the economics of this was crazy, of course. I mean, people aren't happy to pay for that. So you had to have three legs: advertising, subscription, and essentially philanthropy. If you couldn't sort of get all three legs to work, you couldn't make it work. But we did. And the newspaper survived for 15 years. And we sold
so when we talked in a previous episode, we talked previously, didn't we, about people who buy ink by the barrel? You were one of those. You were buying ink by the barrel.
And I enjoyed it tremendously. I did. This is true. Managing director of a current affairs magazine. Who would have thought?
Excellent.
Okay, what about you? Let's hear.
Yes. So my 30s were sort of more monothematic and quite simple. So towards the end of my 20s, I started getting involved in politics, and I was kind of quite a reluctant convert. I think I was brought up, I think, in the school. I think my father was kind of quite a strong influence on me. His attitude to politics might best be described as "don't vote for them; it only encourages them." And so I sort of started in a sort of a pretty sort of skeptical of all the politicians. I was also brought up in a place called Sheffield, which at the time had a Conservative member of Parliament who was part of Margaret Thatcher's parliamentary majority at the time, and a Labour-run city that was really a kind of rotten borough, in the sense that the Labour Party from the left had been running it for 60 or 70 years and sort of completely unchallenged. And so I grew up in this environment of like, politicians, terrible, the Labour Party's screwing up my city and the Conservatives are screwing up my country, and, my dad's right. We should just not get involved. But somehow, towards the end of my 20s, I started thinking, well, a little bit more, like, am I just going to sit and spend the whole of my life shouting at the television when these people come on and essentially feeling disempowered, or is there a way to feel more empowered? And so I got involved in politics. I joined the British Third Party, a party called the Liberal Democrats. They suited my particular outlook, and got elected to local councils. So I cut my teeth in local government. And then at the very end of my 20s, I was selected as a candidate for my home constituency up in Sheffield. I moved back up there and I actually carried on my work, tech work for the NHS, out of an NHS office in a town called Barnsley, which is near to Sheffield. And so carried that on right up until the election. But basically I was spending, as I turned 30, that early part, being a pretty much full-time political candidate. And then age 31, I was elected to Parliament. There was the Great Wave, where the Conservatives were swept out of power. Tony Blair won his first famous victory. And I turned out I was the only not Labour MP in all of my area of South and West Yorkshire, which is the sort of industrial bit of Yorkshire. My nearest Lib Dem colleague was up in Harrogate in North Yorkshire. So I'm sort of arrived into Parliament age 31, just on this idea that I wanted to change things. And then stayed there until I obviously had won one election. Is almost like a matter of pride that you need to fight a second one just to prove that the first one wasn't just down to luck. And so I fought again in the next election, which is 2001, and I won again. And then towards the end of the decade, though, in that second term, I started to feel, I didn't want to do this for life. It's quite common that you do, and we ended up holding the seat. The constituency felt pretty safe, and actually the party held it for 20 years in the end. But I only did the first 8 of those, and then handed it over, and somebody else took it on for the next 12 years. But for those 8 years, sort of from 31 to 39, I was an active member of the UK House of Commons, specialising very much in tech issues. So we talked in our program on privacy about data protection. So in 1998, I was transcribing the Data Protection Directive. I worked on surveillance law. I was fascinated by all the tech law stuff. I got made chairman of a committee, which was kind of unusual, but there was a funny little committee that dealt with parliamentary IT, and they were like, "Oh, here's somebody who knows about IT." So it's a bit like telling all of Parliament to turn it off and turn it on again. That was the committee I ran, the committee of the turn it off and turn it on again people. So I sort of chaired that committee, which was an interesting experience. And then really, sort of as I got into my second term, there was a lot going on, and I started to feel more and more. I mean, it was a fascinating job. It's an amazing responsibility. It's very, very satisfying to represent local people. And in the British system, you're literally, because it's not a sort of proportional or list-based system, I represented 80-odd thousand people who lived in the southwest of Sheffield. That was my sort of day job. And that was fascinating. You felt really valuable a lot of the time. But I started to realize that I just want to spend my whole time doing the technology policy. And I would sit in committee meetings and we'd be, grilling people on the other side of the table who come in to explain why their IT systems had failed for some reason. And I'd be sitting there grilling them. But more and more, I thought, I actually want to be on the other side of the table. I want to be the person who's built something and has to answer for it, rather than the person who is essentially the professional critic. And again, very useful. It's not to dismiss it. Someone has to be the professional critic and hold people to account. But I increasingly felt, I don't want to, spend my whole professional career doing that. I want to be on the other side of the table. I want to be building stuff in this internet economy. And so I decided halfway through that second term that I would step down. I told my constituency party, they selected another candidate. It was a young man by the name of Nicklas, who ended up being the candidate, who went on to do quite interesting things in UK politics. But I sort of managed that transition, managed to get him elected. There's a sort of classic thing when you're an incumbent and you hand over to somebody else, often the vote will sort of crash. And I didn't want that to happen. So I worked very hard with Nick and we actually managed to hold up the vote at pretty much the same level I got, but just 0.5% less, which was enough for my ego just to make sure it's
that's
more than me. I would have been
that's deeply satisfying.
So we got it on target. So I spent time getting Nick elected and I had no job to go to. I just knew I wanted to go into tech. And I knew I wanted to go and be with the people who were building this internet thing. So this is, I'm making my decisions around the year 2000. So this is 99, 2000. I made the decision. 2001, I'm out. Sorry, my timelines are wrong. I'm making this around 2005. This is 2003, 4. 2001 right. was the second election. So this is 2003, 4, and I'm out in 2005. So I wanted to be where the action was 2005. When I had been in Parliament, I'd actually spent quite a lot of time with Cisco, who are not a very famous household name, but for techies, they're the people who actually were sort of pretty substantively built the internet in the sense that they built a lot of the routers and equipment that the internet runs on. And they were very early out there. There was 2 or 3 different companies that built the stuff that the internet runs on. And Cisco had impressed me as a pretty interesting and good company. And they offered me a job 2005. Once I'd left Parliament, they said, hey, now you're free. Would you like to come and work for us? So I went to Cisco and actually had 3 or 4 very good years there, working away. Again, very different. And we're going to get on to talking about working for the Googles and Facebooks. Very different experience I had with them. But that was sort of as I came out, as I ended my 30s, and hit the age of 40, it was the newly released from Parliament and going into the tech sector with a job in a US tech giant, Cisco Systems. So that's got us through our 30. So, you have a question? We're going to come to you. We're going to come to you now.
Yes. No, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's worthwhile stressing that your sort of your public service, I think, is amazing, and I think it's something that actually is forgotten often, how important that is, and how important it is to really engage with politics. And I think that must have, and I think it's worthwhile just reflecting or hearing you reflect on that. The fact that you've been on the other side must have fundamentally shaped also your view of what people are trying to do. You speak about this critic that is a legitimate critic, an important role. And I think a lot of people miss that and they end up in some kind of rote cynicism and say, oh, politicians don't want to do this. They just want to be heard, etc. And I think I would like to hear you reflect a bit more on that, because I think it's so important. If you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of headline take is, I think politics works well when we treat it like just another job, but a quite special and important job. Just like, being a surgeon is just another job. At the same time, quite an important job that people do. Being a lawyer, there's lots of different jobs like that. So I think where politics goes off track is where politicians themselves and the people around them start to think it's something sort of special, that there's some divine qualities imbued, and there is a risk, and some politicians get like that, to be frank, and you can sort of create this whole nonsense around it. But my experience is that most politicians aren't. Most politicians are there to do a good job. And I actually still have huge respect for politicians as a class, having been in there. I left, but it wasn't because I think these people are terrible. I left because I wanted to do something different. But I have huge respect for politicians. They're doing a job for society. And that job, most of it, certainly in a parliamentary system, is an accountability job. The legislation is coming from an executive. The policies are often coming from civil servants, actually, if we're really honest. The sort of hard grunt work of deciding what policy should be put in place is done by civil servants. And so there's an executive who pushes it through. Your parliamentarian is there, though, to represent their constituents, provide this great feedback channel so that if you've got a bad policy, hopefully the people will come and bang on your door and say, this policy is really not working for me. And then you're going to take that back into your parliament. And you're holding the executive to account, and you're going through legislation line by line to test what it really means and make sure that everyone understands what the legislation means. So these are all really, really important functions. And as I say, I've got a huge amount of respect for most of the people who do it. The bit where I part company and maybe why I wasn't so sort of successful as a politician is there is this sort of certain amount of, star quality and put yourself out there and be a kind of quasi celebrity. The old saying, I can use it. It's harsh, but it's true. It's sort of, politics is show business for ugly people. There is that sort of saying that hangs over it. And so that show busy thing, I think is probably where the end that I don't like of it. But the substantive hard graft, I think, is really important work. And so when I came to the other side as somebody working in the industry and I meet a politician, my first assumption is that they're a serious, hard-working politician, that they're not stupid. And again, I've seen, a lot of people are sort of lobbying politicians. They write these sort of letters, and I used to receive them, and it's somebody who disagrees with you, but the letter typically sort of starts with, "Dear politician, the idea that you've got is complete nonsense. Can you tell me whether you've got this idea because A, you are completely stupid, or B, you are corrupt and taking a backhander from somebody?" And you're like, that's not a great starting place for a conversation. And so I'd like to think I've never done that. My assumption is the politician's working in good faith and is reasonably bright and is not corrupt, unless proven otherwise. So I think that I hopefully have been able to bring that to my other work. Yes. So let's get back then to you're now in Google. You've been hired into one of these dangerous public policy teams. So I'd love to hear about that experience again, because people, there's a whole sort of mythology around it. Tech lobbyists going out with bags of cash and trying to buy their way into getting certain forms of influence. Help dispel that myth and tell us what it was really like to go into the Google policy team.
Yes, so you have to remember, I started in the regional policy team. So in 2007, I'm hired to build the Nordic public policy team. And at the time, the Nordics were considered, and I think they still are in some sense, as so benign that they decided that I couldn't just do all 4 Nordic countries on my own. I should probably also take on a few international organizations. So I got to be responsible for the OECD, the ICC, some of the UN work, the IGF, etc. So I got the whole acronym soup that is about tech policy. And the work was interesting because a lot of people had heard about the internet. A lot of people knew what Google was, but they had no idea why Google would be interested in anything that happened in political circles. So I had to invite myself to go around to the different Nordic countries and meet with folks and sit down with them and talk to them and just generally walk them through things that I thought were important for them to know. And there was literally just a series of conversations. The first 2 years at Google was a series of really well-informed, good conversations about technology policy. No bags of money involved, no secret handshakes, no dark networks, no Machiavellian influence plans whatsoever. And I think that the one thing that struck me, having come from sort of both this startup that I ran and the Chamber of Commerce, was that this was really a company that always wanted to be included in every discussion. I think this is one of Google's characteristics. It's a strength, but also a potential weakness. Google has not seen a panel they don't want to be on. Never ever not answered the phone. In stark contrast to a company like Apple. Apple's entire public policy philosophy can be summed up in "don't answer the fucking phone." So seriously, stay away from that phone. It might be ringing, but don't touch the phone. So I mean, that's that, and I think they can do that because there is a Google who goes like, "Oh, ringing phone. Let's see if there are people who want to discuss it." So it's like I think that mentality was so interesting, and the way that the sort of Andrew framed it for us was to say, look, we're clearing a path. A lot of people will have to know about this technology in order for them to feel comfortable with it as it's actually deployed. So the role of a public policy team back then was really that, to have those conversations, a clear path, to make sure that you walk into almost any context and just explain what technology is about and why you shouldn't be afraid of it and how you can put checks and balances in place that make sense. So those were the first 2 years, the Nordic Policy Council job. Now we're in 2009. So in 2009, a couple of different things happened. One of them is that Andrew McLaughlin decides to leave Google to go be the deputy CTO in the Obama administration. So he calls the entire European team into London in order to explain that he's heading off and telling us what's next. And we're talking through a couple of different times, and he takes me aside and he says, I really recommend that you go off to Mountain View and spend a couple of years there, because I think that you're obviously geeky and you like reading stuff, and I think we need a central team. We need some kind of team that just takes care of all of the research, figure out what our arguments are, write the one-pagers, make sure you take care of the international visitors. Some kind of central policy function is needed, and I would love for you to go over and scale that up. And in doing so, you would be working with a couple of people who are already in place, but your job would also be to grow and build this team. And I thought that sounded great. And until I came back to Sweden and spoke to my family, and they did not want to move to Mountain View at all. And I felt terribly bad then, because it was such a nice opportunity, and saying no to something like that and remaining at the company felt wrong. So I quit. I called up my then boss, Rachel Whetstone, and said, I'm not going to be able to take this job, and I feel bad about it. So I quit. And so I left Google for 6 months and went back to the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce. But after those 6 months, we were in February. It was cold, it was snowing, and my family sort of said, maybe Mountain View wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. And I was like, really? You want me to call them up and ask if this is a good idea? So I called them up, and incredibly, Rachel and a few of the other leaders on the team said, sure, great. I'd love to sort of just make sure that you do the interviews, and we'd love to have you back. No hard feelings, no grudges. I thought that was amazing, and I'm still sort of humbled by the opportunity I was afforded there. I think that's sort of a big deal for me. So at that point, I did the interviews, and in 2010, I traveled over to Mountain View to work with this enormous tech company, at its headquarters. And at that point, you would have expected the secret handshakes, the dark networks, and the bags of money. But no, I mean, at this time, this was an enormous campus with colored bikes and lots of people who were engaged in tons of interesting projects. And I remember speaking to Hal Varian, who's our chief economist, who sort of, he used to quip about Google that it's just like a university, but with money. And
yeah.
and it was quite right.
You get paid to go instead of paying to be there.
Instead
they pay
the
you.
Other way around.
Whoa,
yes. It's very strange. And so it was a really, I realize now when I look at it, it was a very privileged position, of course, but it was also a fantastic opportunity to meet with tons of other smart people. I think one of the biggest, most underestimated things about working at Facebook or Google is the other people. That sort of network of intelligence that you connect to is just amazing. So I had 3.5 brilliant years there where I learned tons and had the chance to build a central team across a couple of different continents and really make sure that we had a strategy working. And I had the pleasure of working with some of the brightest people I've ever met in that central team. But after 3.5 years, I decided that I wanted to grow old in Sweden. I also want my kids to go to school here. So we moved back. And I had a brilliant plan. My brilliant plan was to become what is tech company speak is called an individual contributor. An individual contributor is somebody who sits on their own, has a project, can sort of plug away on that project quietly, and then occasionally have great successes, or at least adjust. And it's a kind of a nice role, very underestimated. And I was doing that for all of 2 months before I had a phone call that suggested I apply for another role, which would be to lead the European and then EMEA policy team. I was very hesitant to begin with and said, I just moved my family back to Stockholm. I don't want to move to London or Brussels. And I believe it was Rachel. I don't remember, but I feel it was Rachel who laughed for like a full minute or so when I said that and said, I don't care where you live. You're going to be on an airplane all the time. And that turned out to be right. And so I spent the next 5.5 years doing that. And had roughly 160 travel days here. I guess you had something similar. And I enjoyed it enormously. And so now we're into 2018, 2019. I've done this for 5.5 years. I should really be doing something else. And I was then offered the opportunity to go build a strategic planning team, the policy planning team at Google. And the policy planning team was essentially set up as a scenario planning future studies team to help the company think hard about what are the next questions, the next problems. If we solve all of the problems that you and I have discussed, intermediary liability, content moderation, data protection, what then? What will then happen? So that was tremendously stimulating and super interesting. A small but mighty team that I think is still doing really, really great work at Google. So that's sort of the Google span. And at no point can I say that there were any secret handshakes, dark networks, or bags of money. The closest I've been, and I really missed you there because I think you'd sent somebody else, was when we were all invited, and I say invited,
summoned.
Summoned is the better term,
yes.
I think, to discuss a serious issue, a really serious issue, question of terrorism and platforms, etc., to the G7 interior ministers meeting on a small island outside of Naples. And the amount of helicopters and black boats and everything, I think that would probably have matched up with the expectations. But that was once in 13 years. And so I don't think, there are a few other stories as well, but none of them are very nefarious. And I guess that's a huge disappointment to folks. But, that's the way it is. But I have to just say one thing that I think is before I hand it over to you, because I want to hear from you, of course. And the thing I want to say is, the other thing that I remember is the first time I met you was when Andrew told the team that he was leaving. So it has to have been around 2009, because he had you and I'll let you tell the story, but we met at the Google offices. I think it was the Victoria offices, if I remember correctly. And you had just had a conversation with him, and I met you as you were heading out to the elevators. And I then asked Andrew who you were, and Andrew's story then, which you may or may not want to confirm, was that he had offered you a job, but that you felt that you had a deeper commitment to Cisco at the time, and so that you regretted that you could not take it. But yes. I'll let you tell the rest of that story. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah, that is the story. Yeah, so I've left Parliament and I've gone to work at Cisco Systems, who took a chance on me. And again, we should be candid that former politicians have a mixed reputation. I mean, they can be very good, but they can also be quite a handful, particularly if they're in that sort of minor superstar category where they're not willing to get their hands dirty. And the people at Cisco were very blunt with me and kind of go, why are we going to take a chance on you? You're a politician. We're not sure we want a politician. We want someone who knows how to work hard. But they had taken that chance. I respected them for it. And so, Andrew, you're right. I had a conversation with him and when I was about a year or so into the Cisco job. And I said to him, look, I don't feel it's fair to just churn out of Cisco when I've only just, been there not that long. They've taken a chance on me. So I sort of parked that, although I found the idea very attractive. I think Andrew is very inspirational and your team was fascinating. And I think he invited me back to Victoria to kind of go, like, see what you're missing, because it was great to see the team. And I remember him showing me that you had vending machines where you could get mice and keyboards and kit out of vending machines and all this stuff, which I later came to experience at Facebook. But at that time, that wasn't the sort of Cisco way. So I was back there, and then it was 2009. I was approached by Facebook, and at that time, we got to remember it was a sort of odd little site for kids and teens and university students, the way it was seen. And we can now look back at it, but at the time it was like, this is not mainstream. We're not sure it's going to go anywhere. It's like MySpace is still kicking around. Are these things just a fad? But they contacted me. They had no real infrastructure. They had the office in London. They had one by then, I think, but it was so grotty that they would only meet you in a coffee shop because they were too embarrassed about their offices. And they talked to me and they said, oh, you look like what we're looking for. And they were at the time looking, this is interesting, to hire one person in the United States to look after public policy in the United States and one person outside for kind of
rest of world.
Yeah. I mean, there was an ambition to do more, but immediately they knew they needed someone in Europe. They knew they needed someone in the US. And so I had that conversation with them. And they said, well, can you fly over to California and meet with us? And I almost didn't go. I was, at the time, it was like, and actually I'd applied for a job with the government and various other sort of jobs. And at the time it was like, oh, do I want to go and do that? And actually a friend of mine who's another politician whose husband is a film producer, I had breakfast with her and I said, she was in town. I said, yeah, I'm not sure about going off to California. It's like such a schlep. And she said, well, look, my husband, the film producer, says, take the meeting. Always take the meeting because you don't know what's going to happen. And what's the worst? You've wasted, 4 days going to California and back. Just take the meeting. So I said, okay, you're wise. I'll take the meeting. I flew to California. It was chaos. Like they were on the back of one of Facebook's many sort of chaotic updates to their terms of service. Every time Facebook updates its terms of service, and I'm gratified to see they're still doing this with WhatsApp recently, it's just totally chaotic. Everything sort of spirals out of control. I mean, not because the people there are bad, but because they can't control the story, and the story becomes, they're doing something devious. And so this was the first of those. It was known as TOSGate at the time, Terms of Service Gate. Ooh. And I went in, all these people were kind of completely frazzled, climbing up the walls. They're all bouncing in and out of this room to talk to me, sort of in gym clothes and things as they grabbed 10 minutes. And they were all super bright. And there were all these people like Sheryl Sandberg and Elliot Schrage, who was the boss of the team that I met at the time. And I just thought, like this could all go really badly wrong, but I'm going to learn so much spending some time here. And you made the point earlier, most importantly, I'm going to get to work with some really bright people who are fascinating, who have got all this energy and drive. And I said, I'd done an interview with the British government at the time, which was behind a big wooden table with a panel of 4 people who all asked you the same questions, and they had to be the same questions for every candidate, all like super formal. And to go and to go from that to all these sort of crazy people bouncing into the room, going, "Wow, what ideas have you got? Whoa, what's going on?" But say bright and motivated. Oh, okay, I'm going to take a gamble on that. I'm going to go off to this Facebook company, and we'll see what happens. And friends of mine sort of later have gone. Right? There weren't at that time. It was so. It was. I mean, they were in like later, sort of.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, rough offices, they copied a lot of that sort of Google stuff when they started having their own offices. But at this stage, it was sort of camping out in odd offices in downtown Palo Alto. And they say now people say, well, that was a smart move. And it was. But at the time, it was, quite a risky move. But it was motivated by wanting to work with these people who were just building this thing and so passionate about it. And this is what I mean by getting excited about the internet. And so I joined, and say the team was two policy people at the time, and then I'd actually served longer than most of the people in the team as I built up an operation in EMEA. So I started hiring people in every different country, or not every different country, but across the different countries to cover every country in the region of Europe, Middle East, Africa. EMEA is one of those things like row. It's geek speak, but it basically means Europe, Middle East, Africa. And in our case, also had Russia, countries like Russia, Turkey, so on. We're all part of this region. Yeah, so I built that team up, probably hired about 60 or 70 people over the years, and really enjoyed that. And it was very satisfying. It's just culturally to get to know different places. I got to know Turkey, which I find a fascinating country. And you get to know it sometimes because you've been summoned. You use the word earlier, you've been summoned by the government there, and you're like right in the heart of, the issues, the political issues in that country. And so just this sort of fascinating experience of being in the middle of these quite hot political issues. And with Facebook, again, by contrast with Cisco, it was like, we need to tell you that we've built the internet because they've never heard of you. With Facebook, you go in the meeting and they're often, they're summoning you, and it's because it's quite personal to them. It may be their own activity on Facebook or a family member, but there's something happening that they care about. And so you're having conversations with politicians about stuff they care about. And so I did that, built the team. And then at a certain point, I'd gone as far as I felt I could go with that job, and I wanted to get into some of the more thematic policy areas. So the team moved on to another leader, the regional team, and I took on 4 or 5 of the difficult issues in probably a similar role to the last role you had at Google. But in my case, it was dealing with the issues that are sort of maybe 6 months to a year out rather than the one sort of long term. So there'd be issues like, taxation, economic impact. Actually, I ran the politics and election side of things, or oversaw that for a time. There were good people running all of these functions. I was the sort of overseer and coordinator of all this stuff. And I did that for a couple of years before, after sort of reaching 10 and a bit years, deciding, actually, my family has sacrificed a huge amount while I was doing this stuff. I did try not to be constantly on a plane, but it's sort of inevitable. It comes with the territory. Either you're on a plane or you're distracted, and you're on the phone, and it's all hours of the day, because I was working the European day, the British day, and the Californian day. And that's a long day.
Yes, the bonus day, as we call it. The fact that you get an extra work day at the end of your work day, it's sort of a perk.
Exactly. And then I decided that it was time to sort of stop doing that. And I didn't want to go and say, just go off to another tech company. That wasn't the point at the time. The point was just to kind of stop and spend some time with the family. And then COVID hit. And so at the time I had decided to spend more time with my family. Suddenly the whole world was spending more time with their family. So that's sort of where I've got to. But Nicklas, where are you now? You're not Google anymore, are you?
No. So end of 2020, I decided, I think for a multitude of reasons, that it would be good for me to go somewhere where I had a steeper learning curve. And I had an enormous luck. I was asked by someone to apply for a job at a small tech startup. Well, not so small anymore, I guess, but a small tech startup, financial services tech startup called Stripe. And that's where I currently am. I'm 3 months in, so I will tell you that the one thing I have discovered is that the financial services sector loves acronym even more than tech people, which is both surprising and somewhat disappointing. So there you go. It's an enormous amount of stuff to learn, which is what I wanted. So I'm super happy, and I'm thinking through a lot of different things. anew. You're sort of coming back to questions and revisiting them. And I think that was the one thing, and that is the one thing that I really want to think hard about now. And that is, this thing that we do, public policy and government affairs, is a craft. And I really believe that there's value in, as you and I have started to do, think through what that craft looks like. And that's something that I'm quite passionate about, because I really dislike it when people approach it in a haphazard way, or when people feel that it's just about the sneaky stuff, as you said earlier, the secret handshakes and the bags of money. And it's not. It's a craft, and it's an important craft. It's something that I think makes society stronger if it's done right. So that is something I'm now bringing with me into how I think about, partly how I think about things at Stripe, but also how I think about my own future interests. What do I want to do? How do I want to sort of develop? So that's roughly where I am today. And I'm on an island in the archipelago in Stockholm because of the pandemic. So plenty of time to think.
Excellent.
What about you?
Well, I think so I'm to say I sort of stopped that piece of work, but again, I'm exploring. I'm not learning a new language like you're learning the language of fintech, I guess. So I'm less about learning a new language and more about going back to some of the things I've been interested in for a long time. So that includes looking at open public data. I've always been interested in opening up the data the public sector holds. I'm sort of working with some folks on that. I've got a few spillover things from my time at Facebook, where I'm working with people who are trying to access data for research purposes. I think research in this area is vital. Again, we keep touching on it in many of our podcast episodes, that there's a lot of hypotheses that are being accepted as fact, and they really do need to be tested. So these questions like what effect does seeing misinformation online have on people, at the moment are not really known or solved questions, because the research hasn't happened. So if I can help make sure the data is available for people to be able to research those questions, that's useful. I'm back as a part-time legislator in our crazy British system. I've for a while been a member of the House of Lords, which is the second chamber of the British Parliament. So I spend time voting, which we all do remotely now, because the House of Lords average age, I think, is sort of 70-ish. It's a vulnerable population. And so we decided early on in the pandemic that we would move everything online. And so I can sit there on my phone and participate in the legislative proceedings there. And then to your last point, the bit I'm also really interested in is how do we distill all this knowledge and experience and put it out there. And people may not agree with it, and they may be cynical, and I'm fine with all of that. But I think it's important that people do learn what we've learned and understand how we see things. We, people who work in public policy, they can make of it what they will. But I think it would be a mistake not to get this stuff out on the record. There's too much. I think, again, sort of almost bouncing from the extremes. Either people are, completely drunk the Kool-Aid and are wedded to some technology service and unwilling to accept any kind of, criticism or questions about it. Or at the other end, they're saying technology is entirely evil and they're not willing to kind of concede that the people who work in those companies might have anything good about them. Reality, as a sort of good old liberal centrist, is somewhere in the middle. And I think if we can contribute to that, and I'm enjoying our conversation so much, and I think I'm looking forward to us, I think, being able to write some stuff that may be of interest to our listeners, where we actually try and set out some of the things that we think about how this craft, this business of public policy works, where we think it works well, where we think it doesn't. And I think we can both do that from quite a open and free perspective, given where we're both situated. So that's it. Lots to do, I think, in 2021. But on that happy note, I think we should close this episode. I hope it's been interesting, if a little different from the previous ones. And next week we will be back to digging into some thorny political issue or public policy issue related to technology, back on track again. As ever, do give us any feedback, and this blog post, or this podcast, will be published where, Nicklas? You can do the bit I normally do.
Oh, regulate.tech, and that's
exactly
exactly right.
And on that note, we'll close and speak to you again soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.